So, today, after talking about phylogenies, we're going to start talking about the evidence of change through time for species and life on Earth. But at the time that Darwin's book was released, this was a very controversial idea that species could change through time. At that time, the major thought was that all the diversity that we see on Earth with different organisms and different species were all the product of special creation. And so special creation had three major ideas that it held to. First is that species are independent of one another. So you have each individual species being specially created, and they had no shared history with one another. So, for example, today we know that monkeys are related. Different species of monkeys are related through the evolutionary process, but in special creation, you would say each monkey is its own individual special creation. It also held the idea that life on Earth is young as 6,000 years old. So these calculations to give this 6,000 years old was based on timing in the Bible. And so at that time, they said Earth was a very young planet. And then, of course, the final one is that species are incapable of change. So if each species is a special creation, it's made and that's it, you wouldn't expect it to see any change in response to the environment. So the concept of an adaptation, for example, would not hold true. Those species were made that way and they did not change to be any different. Now, of course, today evolution by natural selection is one of the best supported and most important scientific theories in the field of biology. Of course, it's taken a lot of time to develop this theory. So we start with Darwin and his ideas of natural selection, but there are other types of evolutionary mechanisms that have been studied since then. Today, we have genomic resources to look at genomes of organisms to see how genetic changes have occurred in addition to morphological changes. So it's a theory that has developed quite a bit since Darwin introduced it and is still developing. And of course, as most people are aware of, there's a lot of controversy around evolution. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how thoughts about species has changed over time. So we can go all the way back to ancient Greece, and we can start with Plato. So, in ancient Greece, they were still thinking about, there were a lot of great thinkers then who were thinking about the natural world around them. And one of these thoughts was, how did we get all the diversity of life that we see? So Plato adhered to what we call typological thinking. And so it's the idea that species are unique and they're unchanging. And that when we see variations within species, it's not a big deal. It's unimportant, or he thought it could be misleading. So for example, if you see a population of mice and you see that they have differences in coat color, well, that's fine. They're all still mice. That coat color difference doesn't matter. So species are what they are and they don't change. So Plato adhered to that. Aristotle was also around at this time, and he proposed what's called the Great Chain of Being. So once again, species are what they are. They're fixed types. But to him, some species are what we call better or higher than others. So, he considered, a cat or dog would be considered a better animal than a worm. And of course, at the very top of the Great Chain of Being are humans, because he thought that humans were the best living thing on planet Earth. Now, we actually, before Darwin produced his theory of natural selection and how that causes evolutionary change, we did see another type of evolutionary theory proposed in the early 1800s. This was proposed by Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who proposed a theory that basically says that evolution is progressive. That when animals evolve, it's because they're trying to become better and better, and that this is done through inheritance of what's called acquired traits. So, what do we mean by acquired traits? Acquired traits are something that an individual does in its lifetime at trying to be better, and that trying to be better produces that better trait in its offspring. So let me provide an example of this. So if you look at the giraffes here, okay, so say we start with giraffe 1, and giraffe 1 is pretty short. And giraffe 1 is going to try to stretch its neck and reach to the top of that tree and to eat those leaves. So giraffe 1, he is very short and, has a hard time. But because that he reached and stretched his neck during his lifetime, that reaching and stretching during its lifetime will manifest itself in a slightly longer neck in the offspring it produces in the next generation. So then you get a giraffe that looks like number 2 that you see here. And that giraffe, though he's slightly taller because his parents stretched and reached their necks, he's still not quite tall enough to eat some of those leaves. And so he's going to stretch and reach his neck. And him doing that during his lifetime will produce a longer neck in his offspring, and so on. So it's basically saying that, the parents trying to do something within its lifetime, what that parent was trying to achieve will then just be passed on to its offspring, so the offspring are a better version of what the parents were. So that was considered a theory of evolution, but Darwin, and remember that we mentioned that Alfred Russel Wallace was also coming up with some of these ideas at the same time, really emphasized the concept of change through time within a population. So they had what was called population thinking. And once again, this goes back to what we think about when we talk about natural selection. There's variation within a population. That variation is going to allow some individuals within the population to survive better than others. So with the beetles, the brown will survive better than the green. And as a result, the brown genes remain within the population. Those individuals mate. And so in the next generation, we're going to see a population with more brown beetles. And so, we're not changing individuals over time. Basically, it's based on who is surviving. Whoever survives passes their genes on to the next generation. And as a result, we can see a change in that population in the next generation. So we go from having green and brown variation in generation 1 to more green versus brown in generation 2. And finally, in generation 3, you're going to see mostly brown beetles. So this change through time is occurring because we're having changes in populations based on who's surviving and passing their genes on from one generation to the next. And so the theory of evolution by natural selection was really revolutionary because it turned over this idea that species were made and that was it. With Darwin's theory, we're going to see changes in species over time because of who's surviving and mating. And so this, based on that replaced what we call the typological thinking, where each species is on its own and doesn't change, to the population thinking, where once again, we see changes in the population due to who's surviving and passing their genes on to the next generation. And the fact that it was a scientific theory and it could be tested both through observation and experimentation. So we're able to today look and see this theory of evolution. We see this natural selection happening and causing change through time in populations. So if you think back to bacterial resistance, right? We have before selection, we have different levels of resistance within the population of bacteria as indicated by the different colors of circles you see at the top here before selection. After selection, we can see that those without high resistance don't live. The ones that do live are the ones that are going to reproduce. And so in our final population, we are going to see high resistance throughout all of those individuals. And you can see at the population before selection and the final population are very different from one another and have changed through the course of time via natural selection. And so Darwin really described evolution as descent with modification. And this was brought about by observations that he had. So he collected a lot of fossils on his journey of the Beagle, and he saw fossils that looked like things that were living at that time. They looked really similar, but they were different. And so what he proposed is that species that lived in the past are going to be the ancestors of species that live today. And that via examining fossil evidence, that he could see that these species did in fact change through time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to examine the evidence for change through time in class after we talk about phylogenies, and then in the following lecture, we're going to talk about descent from a common ancestor and the evidence for that through what we call homology.